good success in your week coming up. Right now, we're going to give you another little boost for the week coming up called motivation, the academic energizer. Motivation is so important. When you traffic in the business of education, you can sometimes feel like a peddler of so much stardust. Education cannot be eaten, seldom brings immediate pleasure, and its long-term dividends are often obscure. Students reflect this feeling in statements like, "Why do I have to take physics anyway?" Or "Whoever asks you what a gerund is when you're a construction worker?" An expansive and aged professor would probably lean back in his chair and pontificate about the virtues of a good foundation if you presented the matter to one. But that doesn't solve the problem of a student's feelings and emotions about his current experiences in education. Motivation is by far a teacher's highest challenge and most consequential task. Without some degree of immediate motivation, learning simply will not take place. Motivation is what makes academics take hold. It is the elixir of the whole process. Students will possess a measure of it themselves before you ever begin to work on it, but it most often will come from one of a couple low incentives. In the earlier years, it comes from a desire to please the teacher or the parent. When the child is older, however, it will be to escape a parent's reprisal or to gain peer prestige. It is not until years later, and for some it may never happen at all, sadly, that a person begins to internalize academia and desire it for its own intrinsic worth to their own human potential. It is the teacher's challenge to help this last motivation take hold much earlier than it otherwise would if left up to the students themselves. So, to accomplish this, the academics of the classroom must be made relevant, not in the trite sense that you link Columbus's voyage to what students will eat at lunch, making their hot dogs into a boat that crosses their plate. We're not talking about that. But that you make the acquisition of that fact important to the progress of their brain. They must come to see their own brain as an ever-enlarging storehouse of potential and respect it as their most sacred organ. Feeding the brain is every bit as important as feeding the physical body, and the material you present the brain is very important. We don't want to put junk in the brain. Just like we don't want to eat junk food, we don't want junk going in the brain. So it's important, as we've talked about many times, to watch over that media input. How much of it is there and how much of it is ruinous fantasy or unrealities that Yeshua would never bless, or absorption with evil. So we want to really protect the material that we present to the brain, in addition to grow the brain's potential to manipulate that material. So you must go to work on the brain. The surgeon approaches the brain in one way, the teacher in another. The surgeon is limited by what's there organically. The teacher, on the other hand, has the privilege of actually expanding the capacities within the brain, growing dendrites. There are two things that the teacher wants to do when working with the brain. One is to enlarge its conceptual base. How much does it know about general information about the world around it? And the other is to cultivate the brain's mental agility in manipulating that information, sequencing it, evaluating it, referencing it, etc. The student's academics then need to be interpreted to them in the light of these two goals in order for meaningful motivation to take place. It is a phenomenon of the brain that the more it knows, the more it can know. So even if you have a person in a coma, or let's say a child has been locked in a closet or been vastly understimulated by some unfortunate circumstances and has only seen one room for years and years, or somebody who's been in prison, that perceptual base begins to be truncated and it doesn't grow. So you have to grow a network by stimulation. In other words, there's a type of network operating that allows brain function to increase exponentially with the addition of each new stimulus. So stimulation is important to the brain with new material all the time, new exposures, enlarging the exposures. So imagine the brain as one gigantic pegboard, for example. At first there's one peg, and then there's two pegs, and then there's three. The addition of the third peg not only has its own worth, but when combined with peg number 1 and peg number 2, creates multiple potentials. And so it is with each new peg until the brain becomes like a complex switchboard. Rapidly, in addition to receiving external stimulus, the brain is then able to generate its own combinations within the brain. Another way to look at this is that you're laying down a highway, a freeway system within the brain. So when the child is very young, you're laying down the interstates, for example, the big, huge highways, the interstates, the things that go across the continent. And then as the child grows, you're attaching smaller roads and highways off from the big interstates. And then those roads are connected with little county roads and little village roads, etc., until you get a very complex transport system in place. And then information can zip, zip, zip all around the brain because it has lots and lots of freeways, lots of road work to travel upon. So the teacher's role then is to build up the infrastructure, to set down, it's like setting down a railroad track from one ocean to the other. You're setting down the foundation. You're building the foundational pegboard, or setting down the railroad track, or developing the road system. The more diverse vocabulary, for example, you enable a student to acquire, the more he's able to think philosophically and abstractly. So when you're dealing with young children, go ahead and use large vocabulary words. Talk to him about his epidermis being his skin, or just don't truncate your language with him. Go ahead and speak with the large vocabulary, and he'll pick up the meanings and they will begin to grow highways for him. The more history he can know, the more he's able to bring ideas to bear on his own present slice of time. The more mathematical equations he manipulates, the more he's able to understand relationships between cause and effect. The more science he knows, the greater his appreciation for the order and predictability of nature. The more art and culture the student knows, the more he's able to understand the implications of his own humanity. It is not the facts along the way that are particularly important in and of themselves. As we know all too well, many of those are forgotten from year to year. We forget them over the summer. But the facts are necessary because of what they lead to. Again, the more one knows, the more one can know. The art of motivation then lies in the teacher's ability to create meaningful associations between what the student already knows and what they're about to learn. The more relevant and creative those bridges become, the more intense the desire will be to learn. Take, for example, the presentation of the concept of a lake to a desert nomad who has never seen a lake. You begin by showing the nomad a clay pot full of water, his only familiar concept. That's the current peg in his pegboard. Then you enlarge upon the idea by placing many pots side by side in a circle, thus enabling him to imagine a lake. That in turn becomes a new peg to him, and then you can go on to talk about a boat. The nomad would not have understood the larger seafaring vessel with only the clay pot full of water. There would be no way for him to conceptualize it if there wasn't that foundational peg, or if there weren't additional foundational pegs presented to him. Hence, the idea of a boat would not be at all relevant to him, and he would have no motivation to learn about it. So it is with mathematical equations, language, etc. They're just as remote and boring to the students as the boat is to the nomad if we leave out those intermediate foundational pegs and strong bridges to promote understanding. In fact, if a student appears to be having trouble handling a new concept, the teacher's fastest avenue of help is to go back and shore up the student's undergirding concepts. Discover the weak link in the chain and build that up first. So consider the following scenario. Here's another one. One day, a teenager was asked by her parents to go to the opera and hear a coloratura opera singer, an experience that was going to become a new peg in her pegboard. However, her parents put no conceptual base underneath it. There was no conceptual slot to fasten the new experience to when she finally encountered the event. Her only comment at the end of the show was, "That woman gave me a headache. She hurt my ears." Now, she couldn't possibly be talking about decibel level because her own rock music had no doubt been played twice as loud with no ill effects whatsoever. The problem was that no meaningful bridges had been built before the experience. So, how would we do that? Well, a normal singing range could have been discussed with her, and she could have tried to see how high her own voice would go by playing up the scale on a piano and singing up the scale. To have been told that the coloratura voice would sing 2 octaves above her own highest note would have generated at least some curiosity and appreciation for the skill involved in the experience. But as it was, no growth took place. Let's take a third example. If a teacher rambles on and on about the Civil War without ever first discussing the students' own experiences with sibling rivalry, or the possibility of their home church splitting right down the middle, you can count on boredom. But the more adroitly the event is put in immediate terms, the more emotion will be rallied for the subject at hand. Once the intermediate pegs are established, and then this war is discussed, then other wars can begin to be understood by it. Okay, let's take another one. Today we're going to study Shakespeare's Macbeth, for example. The teacher could say, turn to page 150, we're going to study Macbeth. Automatic turn-off for the students, but begin with a discussion of vaulting ambition without even a mention of Macbeth, and watch the effect the bridge will have. You can begin by asking the students, have you ever known anyone who was ambitious? What did it do to them? What were they like as people? Is ambition wrong? How would you describe ambition? What have you ever been ambitious about? What did it cause you to discover about yourself? What were your temptations, your successes? Then later challenge them to further understand ambition by an excursion into the mind of Macbeth. Do you see how it works? In the more abstract fields of mathematics and physics, you build the motivational bridges by showing how these subjects increase the brain's ability to manipulate information. Grammar can even be taught that way. You can tell the students, forget about the word grammar if you want to. You're after an increase in your brain's fluency and flexibility. Have them approach it like they would gymnastics. Make their brains work as they would exercise any other muscle. Then when they want the mental agility for a subject that they're really interested in later on, it will be there. They cannot muster mental flab on the day that something suddenly becomes important to them. Mental discipline and concentration is taught. It is experienced. It is practiced. There will be a spillover into their larger life if they'll tie into concentration today over any topic whatsoever. So, what's your standard line going to be when they say, what does this geometry have to do with real life? You say you're growing mental ability. You're growing the ability to concentrate, to stick with a perplexity until you work it through. Now, the best motivation of all is having children read biography, of scientists, inventors, historians, etc. Read biography. And the apex of biography is reading, for believers, is reading missionary biography. Missionary biography simply motivates the entire person with heroism demonstrations of putting the self under that are lofty and challenging and exciting. When children read these missionary biographies, they learn that they can sleep on the hard floor and do it with contentment, or they can eat any food, or food out of a can even, with contentment, or they can live in extreme cold or live in extreme heat with contentment if their eye is set on the goal of loving the unbeliever into the kingdom. So you can just have your children read enormous amounts of missionary biography. Read every one you can possibly find, and start with the easy versions. There are third grade large print versions that are put out by YWAM, and there are progressively intricate and more difficult biographies as they go. So that is your zenith for motivation. Motivate by the whole person, the entire life story of a person whose life was very exciting. They lived in the same skin, and they had the same earth to walk, and yet they did something very thrilling with their life, and that will be motivational to your students and your children. So if the ways to create bridges are not obvious to you in your particular subject area, then brainstorm them with a colleague, an expert in those fields. Ask them how they create these sorts of conceptual bridges. They can be found. The universe is all marvelously interrelated because Yahweh created all the parts to lend understanding to all the other parts. Motivation is important. Without it, there is no education. And with it, students can begin to grasp what it means to be made in the limitless image of God. All right, now we're going to follow this little study of motivation by another little study of smart study skills. Once the child is motivated and then there's content to be studied, let's learn how to optimally study. We're going to be dealing here with working smarter, not harder. And these skills are desperately needed in college and high school, but you can begin to teach them to fourth graders and even younger than that. Okay, so want to cut time wasters and ensure strong recall? Here are some get-ahead strategies for studying efficiently and effectively. Having poor study habits is the single most important cause of students flunking out of college. Even some brilliant students don't know how to study well and never get very far because of it. You don't need to be one of them. Your children don't need to be one of them. They can begin to acquire good study skills even as young as you can take them, as young as first grade, by knowing how to conquer and retain the material in the chapter of a textbook, for example, for later years. We'll discuss that later. But let's look at the general things that can be applied even to young children. So study skills, let's just get this clear in our head. You can deal with the same material and have good study skills or poor study skills, and the results will be vastly different. So you can be presented with the same material, and what is retained, what is actually understood, can be miles apart depending upon the study skills you bring to bear. Okay, so number one is organize. Organize your desk or your room first, or both. If you have no distracting objects on your desk, games, sports magazines, other unfinished projects, you'll focus better. Visual clutter often contributes to mental clutter, and some people who are perfectionists in this area will even put a little handkerchief over their clock or their radio, anything to just eliminate all distractions. Okay, so organizing first. And you with your students, all their materials need to be in a Tupperware container. They need to have their own pencil sharpener and their own several pencils. Ticonderoga #2 pencils are the best, and latex-free erasers so that they don't rip the paper and they actually erase. Those are the best erasers. They're generally all white, and you can get little packages of them even at Walmart. So you want to have all their supplies right there so they don't waste any time getting up to sharpen a pencil, they don't waste any time looking for a pencil, and they don't waste any time wondering where their textbooks or paces are. They're all in their container that they can pick up, take in the back seat of the car. The container has a lid on it. They can take them when they travel, when they run errands, when they visit relatives. So their schoolwork is with them at all times to constantly grow their brain. Okay, number 2, scheduling. Start all projects and papers early. If you're doing this for an outside teacher, plan to finish all projects and papers a week early. Pencil in those early deadlines on a calendar. Never turn in projects or homework late. It takes just as much time to finish your project early as it does late. So you just have to manage that time better. In other words, you're not saving any time by turning homework in late. It takes an equal amount of time to turn it in early or late. It's simply a matter of organization and putting that date on the calendar. If you put those early deadlines on a day or a week early, then that last week you can just be doing brush-up work, mop-up work, polishing, cosmetic work on your papers. But the bulk of it is done. The back of it is broken. So must pencil in early deadlines for everything. Next, make a schedule and stick with it. Schedule study hours for the middle of the day. Now, for college students, I used to tell them, even when I was a head resident, that look, all your life you're going to have an 8 to 5 job, most of you, the majority of you. So if you have to get your body in the habit of working from 8 to 5, begin that process in college or high school. And when you have classes scheduled And you'll have huge blocks of time between classes often. And even over lunch breaks, those might go for an hour and a half or something. And usually students, immature students, undirected and ungoal-oriented students, will use that time to kibitz with a friend or take a walk or have that as downtime or play a video game or whatever. And then in the evening, they're loaded up, laboring under continued schoolwork. So if they work between their scheduled classes, go find a classroom that's quiet, where no one is, an empty classroom, and open your books and study between that first hour and that third hour, for example, if you have the second hour free. Study then, and then your evenings and your weekends will be free. You will be a free man while all the other students are laboring under unfinished projects. Now, use your prime time for prime academic rigor. Don't use prime time for laundry, errands, phone calls, or maintenance tasks. Do your maintenance tasks, vacuuming your room and all that stuff, at low brain power ebb, low ebb. Do those things in the evening. And we even talk about when you're sick, limp when wounded. Do something when you're sick. Keep going so that you're using all time to its greatest strength. So you could schedule like phys ed classes and exercise routines and stuff for slump times, and reserve high blood sugar and high energy times for tougher classes and harder mental work. You might find alternating active and passive periods very helpful. This you can do with any homeschooler. They might be working for a while and then they get up and they can do 10 jumping jacks, 10 push-ups, and 10 sit-ups, and get rid of all the cobwebs and be right back at their desk again. That took maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes, or jump on a small rebound or trampoline. That will clear the cobwebs out of the head. But for longer activities like a full body workout or a run, a 3-mile run, you'd want to put that later in the day, not during high cerebral time. You know, most working people don't get off work until 5:30 or 6, so why should you? Tell yourself that your full-time job is school for now, and that you don't get off till 5:30 or 6 either. I'm talking about when you're looking at organizing the whole day. The afternoon might be spent in home-based businesses or developing music acumen or physical acumen. But what you're doing, you get the gist, is you're scheduling yourself quite tightly. Go to bed at 10 or before. Studying late at night is unproductive. 1 hour in the early morning is worth 2 just before midnight. Remember Ben Franklin's maxim, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. I used to watch bizarre schedules of some college students in the dorm decades and decades ago. When they would they'd say, I'm going to pull an all-nighter and I'm going to study all night. And they would pick the lobby where all their friends were to study. Number 1 mistake. Number 2, they would study a little bit and then they'd get so tired they'd take a nap on the couch. And then they'd get up, they'd set their alarm and get up another hour, and they'd work from 12 to 1 in the morning and then take another nap and then get up. So they were neither getting deep sleep nor getting their study done. It was the worst of both worlds. It was not an organized, predictable bedtime that would produce the greatest mental acumen. Now, make it a point not to study on the Sabbath. There are numerous stories of students who chose to honor the Lord this way by taking a Sabbath rest all throughout their college years and wound up with exceedingly good grades and good job opportunities afterwards. Clearly, they found the scriptural promise to be true. They that honor me, I will honor. Now, I want to go back to that bedtime thing for a moment, and I remembered a story I want to tell you. A story that was written decades ago, pulled it out of an old book, where a man traced the habits of 2 students that were in an inn, and one would play and party and drink till 3 in the morning and then fall in bed late, and the other would rise up at 3 o'clock to have devotions and then begin their studying. And he traced these 2 individuals for 10 years, and of course the one who rose up early had a nice fat bank account, had influence in the culture, had advantages that were tremendous from his diligence and scheduling, just mere scheduling. So that is a quick look at some smart study skills. We began that discussion and we'll finish it up next week. Shalom!